Marco Silva stood out in any crowd. A middle-aged black man with a solid, muscular build, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. His hair, closely cropped, showed flecks of gray, hinting at the many years of hard work and dedication behind him. Marcos was a renowned judge, someone who had spent decades climbing the ranks of the justice system, earning his place through relentless dedication and an unwavering belief in fairness and equality. Yet, despite his prestigious position, he remained grounded, and every morning, he followed a routine that allowed him to reconnect with himself. On this particular Saturday, the sky was clear, and the air had that crisp, early morning freshness. Marcos arrived at the small neighborhood park, a simple but well-maintained spot nestled in a middle-class suburb. It wasn't the fanciest park, but it had everything he needed. A set of metal bars for pull-ups, a bench for dips, and enough open space to do his bodyweight exercises. This park had become his sanctuary, a place where he could clear his mind, reflect on his cases, and escape the stress of the courtroom. As he began his workout, he moved with a smooth precision that spoke of years of discipline. He wasn't just any man lifting weights in the park. He was someone who had achieved greatness but chose simplicity over extravagance. The sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over his dark skin, and he closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the peace. This was his time, his way of grounding himself before another week of intense legal battles. He had always believed that the law could be a tool for justice, but it wasn't until he started experiencing the subtle and blatant prejudices firsthand that he truly understood the weight of his role. This understanding only deepened his resolve, making each pull-up, each push-up, a testament to his resilience. Marcos's routine was interrupted by the faint sound of a car pulling up nearby, but he paid it no mind. He was used to being watched, whether in the courtroom or in public. After all, in his tailored suits, he looked every bit the part of the successful professional. But today, in his simple gym clothes, he was just another man trying to carve out a bit of peace in a world that often demanded too much. This moment, however, was about to become anything but peaceful. As Marcos paused to catch his breath, he noticed, from the corner of his eye, a figure approaching him with deliberate steps. He took a deep breath, unaware that this would be the last moment of solitude he'd have that morning. As Marcos continued his workout, he sensed the presence of the approaching figure becoming more deliberate, almost aggressive in its pace. He glanced up and saw a man in uniform, a police officer. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the authoritative swagger of someone used to being obeyed. The officer's face was hardened, his eyes narrow and sharp. This was Ricardo Almeida, a white police officer with a reputation for being confrontational, especially towards minorities. Marcos could feel an unsettling tension in the air, a kind he had encountered many times in his life, but had hoped he would be spared from today. Ricardo watched Marcos with a critical eye, his gaze scanning up and down, searching for any sign of wrongdoing. To him, it didn't matter that Marcos was a man of stature, or that he was simply exercising in a public space. What Ricardo saw was a black man, a suspicious presence in a neighborhood that he felt should be reserved for people who looked like him. He had patrolled this area for years and had made it his unspoken duty to question anyone he felt didn't belong. "Hey, you!" Ricardo's voice cut through the stillness of the morning, loud and brash. "What are you doing here?" Marcos looked up, meeting Ricardo's stare with calm eyes. "I'm exercising," he replied, his tone polite but firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Ricardo took a step closer, invading Marcos's personal space, as if trying to assert his authority through proximity. "You got some ID on you?" he demanded. There was no warmth in his voice, only a thinly veiled hostility. Marcos sighed internally. He had been here before, many times, despite his accomplishments, despite his status. He reached into his gym bag and pulled out his wallet. "Why do you need to see my identification?" he asked, handing over his ID. "It's just a routine check," Ricardo responded. But there was nothing routine about the way he was glaring at Marcos. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." Marcos raised an eyebrow. Suspicious activity? At 7 in the morning? In a public park? His words were measured, careful, but there was an undercurrent of frustration that he couldn't entirely mask. "Yeah, you'd be surprised," Ricardo shot back. "A lot of people trying to cause trouble these days." He glanced down at the ID, his expression hardening further when he saw Marcos's full name and profession. But instead of backing off, Ricardo smirked, clearly unimpressed. "And what brings a judge like you out to this part of town, huh? Don't you have your fancy gym memberships for this?" Marcos maintained eye contact, his expression unyielding. "I enjoy the outdoors," he replied, "and I live nearby. Is there a law against that?" Ricardo's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of irritation. It was clear he wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he had already decided didn't belong. "Maybe there should be," Ricardo muttered, handing back the ID with a little more force than necessary. As Marcos took it, he could feel the unease settling deeper, recognizing that this was no longer just a casual encounter. It was the beginning of something much more insidious. Ricardo wasn't done. Despite having seen the ID and confirming that Marcos had every right to be there, he wasn't willing to let go of this interaction. Something about Marcos's calm, self-assured demeanor irritated him, as if his very existence in this space was a challenge to Ricardo's sense of authority. The officer crossed his arms, leaning in closer as if to assert dominance. "How long have you been out here?" Ricardo asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Marcos straightened up, meeting Ricardo's gaze evenly. "About 30 minutes, he replied. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Ricardo scoffed, shaking his head. "You think you're clever, don't you?" He took a step back and gestured around the park. "A man like you, working out here alone, doesn't add up." "A man like me?" Marcos echoed, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "You know exactly what I mean," Ricardo snapped, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "This neighborhood doesn't usually see people like you. So, forgive me for doing my job and making sure everything's in order." The thinly veiled racism in Ricardo's words was unmistakable, and for a moment, Marcos felt a flash of anger. He had faced this type of subtle hostility countless times before, in stores, in restaurants, even in courtrooms. But coming from a police officer, the implications were far more dangerous. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over a decade," Marcos said evenly. "I've come to this park almost every day for the last 5 years. I have every right to be here." Ricardo wasn't ready to let it go. He took another step closer, invading Marcos's space. "Let me ask you something," Ricardo began, tilting his head. "Why does a judge need to work out in a place like this, huh? You looking for trouble? Trying to make a point?" Marcos's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, officer," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to stay healthy, like everyone else." Ricardo's frustration was palpable. He was used to people cowering, to them submitting to his authority without question. But Marcos wasn't giving him that satisfaction. He needed to push further, to force Marcos into a position where he could assert his control. "I want you to empty your pockets," Ricardo demanded, his tone suddenly sharp. "I need to make sure you're not carrying anything illegal." Marcos took a step back, his jaw tightening. "I don't consent to that," he replied firmly. "You have no reasonable cause to search me." Ricardo's expression twisted into something ugly, and for a moment, the mask slipped, revealing the anger and prejudice that simmered just beneath the surface. "You think you're above the law because you're a judge?" he sneered. "Out here, you're just another suspect." Marcos held his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "No," he said quietly but with undeniable strength. "Out here, I am still a man with rights. And so far, you haven't given me a legitimate reason to believe I've violated any of them." The tension between them was palpable now, an unspoken battle of wills playing out in the early morning light. Ricardo's hand twitched toward his radio, as if contemplating whether to escalate this further, while Marcos stood tall, refusing to be bullied. "You really want to do this?" Ricardo growled, his voice low and threatening. "I can make this a lot harder for you." Marcos didn't flinch. "You're welcome to try, officer," he replied, "but I would advise you to think very carefully about your next move." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the weight of all the histories, all the injustices, and all the battles that had come before this moment. Marcos could feel his pulse quickening, but he forced himself to remain composed. Years of experience in the courtroom had taught him how to keep his emotions in check, even when faced with blatant hostility. He had faced aggressive lawyers, ruthless criminals, and media scrutiny, but something about this moment felt different. It was raw, personal, and inescapable. Taking a slow, steadying breath, he locked eyes with Ricardo and spoke with a calmness that belied the storm brewing inside him. "Officer, I understand that you have a job to do," Marcos began, his voice measured. "But you've seen my identification. You know who I am. I've given you no reason to suspect me of any crime. So I ask again, what exactly are you looking for?" Ricardo's jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who refused to back down. "You're asking a lot of questions for someone who should be cooperating," he snapped. "People who don't have anything to hide don't mind being checked out. People who know their rights don't allow themselves to be harassed," Marcos countered, his tone sharpening slightly. "I know my rights, officer, and you are dangerously close to violating them." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Ricardo's face, but it was quickly replaced by anger. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think your title means something to me? Out here, you're just another guy who doesn't know his place." Marcos felt a surge of indignation, but he refused to let it show. "And where exactly is that place, officer?" he asked, his voice steady. "Please enlighten me." Ricardo stepped back, clearly caught off guard by Marcos's refusal to be intimidated. For a moment, the officer was at a loss for words, his hands twitching as if he were considering reaching for his baton or something more. The tension hung thick in the air, and Marcos could feel the eyes of a few early morning joggers and dog walkers starting to turn in their direction. The quiet park was no longer a sanctuary but a stage, and Marcos knew that any wrong move now could have devastating consequences. "Look, you're making this harder than it needs to be," Ricardo muttered, his bravado faltering. "Why don't you just cooperate, and we can both be on our way?" "I have been cooperating," Marcos replied, his patience wearing thin. "But cooperation doesn't mean surrendering to intimidation or allowing myself to be treated as less than a man." There was a brief silence as the two men stared each other down, neither willing to be the first to break. Ricardo opened his mouth to retort, but Marcos raised a hand, stopping him. "Let me make something clear," Marcos said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that demanded attention. "You may have authority, but you do not have absolute power. I've spent my entire life upholding the law, ensuring that it protects the innocent and holds the guilty accountable. And I will not stand here and allow you to abuse that law simply because you think you can." Ricardo blinked, momentarily stunned by the sheer force of Marcos's words. It was as if he had never encountered someone so willing to challenge him, so unafraid of his authority. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, his voice rising. "Is that it? You think your fancy degree and your big job make you untouchable?" "No," Marcos said quietly. "I don't think I'm better than you. I think I'm a man who deserves the same respect and dignity as anyone else. Just like you." The sincerity in Marcos's words seemed to catch Ricardo off guard, and for a brief moment, the hostility in his eyes dimmed. But just as quickly, the mask of aggression returned, and Ricardo straightened up, as if reminding himself of the role he was expected to play. "You think you're going to teach me about respect?" he sneered, though his voice lacked the same conviction. "We'll see about that." Marcos knew this wasn't over, but he also knew he had drawn a line in the sand. He had refused to be cowed, refused to be reduced to another statistic, another victim of an abuse of power. And in that moment, he felt a surge of quiet, unshakable strength. Ricardo's face twisted with frustration as he realized Marcos wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to simply submit to his show of power. It was as if Marcos's calm, unyielding demeanor was a mirror, reflecting back all the insecurities, fears, and prejudices that Ricardo tried so desperately to mask with aggression. Desperation began to creep into his actions, and he felt a burning need to reassert control over the situation. to remind Marcos who held the power in this moment. "All right, enough of this," Ricardo snapped, stepping even closer and pointing a finger in Marcos's face. "Get on the ground. Now, I'm not going to ask you again." Marcos stood his ground, a chill running down his spine, but he refused to let the fear take over. "You have no right to order me to the ground, officer," he said firmly. "I've done nothing wrong." Ricardo's temper flared, his face reddening with anger. "I said get on the ground," he shouted, reaching for his baton and holding it threateningly in front of him. "Don't make me use force." Marcos felt his heart rate quicken, a rush of adrenaline surging through him, but he took a step back and raised his hands slightly, more as a gesture of peace than submission. "Officer, I'm asking you to think carefully about what you're doing," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "This is not going to end the way you think it will." "You don't tell me how this ends," Ricardo shouted, and he took a step forward, shoving Marcos in the chest with the baton. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was enough to throw Marcos off balance, enough to send a ripple of fear through him. But instead of giving in to that fear, Marcos took a deep breath, planting his feet firmly on the ground. "I am a judge," Marcos said, louder this time, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "And I will not be treated like a criminal in my own community." Ricardo froze, his eyes widening as if he was suddenly seeing Marcos for the first time. But even as he hesitated, the need to assert his authority, to justify his actions, pushed him further. "You're not above the law," Ricardo muttered, his voice trembling slightly now. "No one is." "No," Marcos agreed, "but neither are you." For a moment, it seemed as if Ricardo might actually listen, might actually take a step back and reconsider his actions. But then he noticed the gathering crowd. Several people had pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation, murmuring among themselves. Ricardo felt the eyes of the world on him, judging him, questioning him, and that only fueled his desperation. He couldn't back down now, not in front of all these people. "Hands behind your back," Ricardo ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. "You're under arrest." "For what?" Marcos demanded, his voice rising for the first time. He could feel his anger bubbling to the surface, threatening to spill over. "What crime have I committed, officer? Exercising in a public park? Existing while black?" Ricardo's hand shook as he held the cuffs, his eyes darting around at the crowd that was now openly filming him. He knew he was losing control, that he was dangerously close to crossing a line he couldn't come back from. "Resisting," Ricardo muttered, almost to himself. "Obstructing an investigation." "What investigation?" Marcos challenged, stepping forward. "You had no reason to approach me in the first place. This isn't about the law. This is about power." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, and for a moment, Ricardo's face twisted with something that looked like shame. But before he could respond, a voice called out from the crowd. "Leave him alone. He hasn't done anything wrong," a young woman shouted, her phone held high as she recorded the scene. "Yeah, this is harassment," another man chimed in, taking a step forward. "You can't do this just because you have a badge." The crowd's support emboldened Marcos, and he took another step toward Ricardo, his eyes locked on the officers. "It's over," he said quietly. "You need to stop this before it's too late." Ricardo stood there, frozen, the cuffs dangling from his fingers as he struggled to maintain the illusion of authority. He looked at Marcos, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, fear. Not of Marcos, but of the consequences of his actions, of the reality that was closing in around him. Ricardo's eyes darted around, desperately searching for a way out of the situation he had created. The crowd was growing, their murmurs becoming louder, their voices challenging his authority. He took a shaky step back, trying to regain control, but the power was slipping from his grasp. Marcos, sensing the shift, decided it was time to end this confrontation once and for all. "Officer," Marcos began, reaching into his gym bag slowly, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. "You want to know who I am? You want to know why I won't just lie down and accept your abuse of power?" Ricardo's eyes widened, and he instinctively tightened his grip on his baton. ready for any sudden move. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked. But there was an unmistakable tremor in his voice now. Marcos didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly pulled out a sleek black wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming badge and an ID card. He held it up for Ricardo to see, letting the realization sink in. "I am Judge Marco Silva of the State Supreme Court," Marcos said, his voice clear and authoritative. "I have presided over cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and the very abuse of power you are displaying right now." The color drained from Ricardo's face. He stared at the badge, blinking rapidly as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. You're a judge?" he stammered, the arrogance melting away to reveal a mixture of shock and panic. "Yes, I am," Marcos replied, taking a step closer, his voice growing firmer. "And you, Officer Almeida, have not only overstepped your authority but have engaged in a clear act of racial profiling and harassment. You have violated my rights and abused your power, and I promise you, this will not go unaddressed." Ricardo's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his confidence shattered. I didn't know," he muttered weakly, lowering his baton. "I was just doing my job." "No," Marcos corrected, his eyes narrowing. "You were not doing your job. You were using your position to intimidate and demean someone based solely on the color of their skin. And that is not just unprofessional, it's illegal." The crowd, now fully invested in the unfolding drama, erupted in whispers and murmurs of support. A few people stepped forward, angling their phones to capture Ricardo's reaction, ensuring that every word, every expression would be preserved. "This is going viral," someone murmured excitedly. "He's done for." Ricardo's panic deepened, and he took another step back, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean any harm. I thought." "You thought you could get away with it?" Marcos interrupted, not letting him finish. "You thought that because I'm a black man in workout clothes, I would be powerless against your authority. But you were wrong." For the first time, Ricardo looked truly defeated. His shoulders slumped, and he hung his head, unable to meet Marcos's eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words sounded hollow, empty. Marcos stared at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a voice full of quiet resolve, he said, "I don't want your apology. I want accountability. I want you to understand that your actions have consequences. Today, you tried to strip me of my dignity, my humanity, and you would have done the same to any other black man in my position, judge or not." The silence that followed was deafening. Ricardo stood there, looking utterly lost, while Marcos slowly put his wallet back into his gym bag. He took one last look at the officer, then turned his attention to the crowd. "Remember this moment," he said, addressing them. "Remember that we have the power to demand respect, to stand up against injustice, and to hold those in power accountable. It's up to us to make sure this doesn't keep happening." With that, Marcos turned his back on Ricardo, a silent act of defiance that spoke louder than any words could. And as he walked away, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers following him as he left the park, leaving Ricardo to face the weight of his actions alone. As Marcos walked away, Ricardo stood frozen, still clutching the cuffs that he had never managed to snap around Marcos's wrists. The realization of what he had done, the depth of his prejudice, the misuse of his authority, and the consequences that were about to crash down on him weighed on him like a boulder pressing on his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the morning sun. For the first time, Ricardo felt small, insignificant, and completely powerless. The badge on his chest, which he had always thought of as a shield of invincibility, now felt like a heavy burden, a symbol of the damage he had inflicted on others. He looked around at the crowd, many of whom still had their phones trained on him, and the fear of exposure, of the world seeing him for who he truly was, sank deep into his bones. He knew his career was at risk. He had seen fellow officers get caught in viral videos, seen how the footage could strip away all the layers of protection that the uniform provided. And now, he was the one under the microscope. The crowd's judgmental eyes seemed to burn holes in him, and for the first time, Ricardo felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: shame. "Hey, man!" a voice from the crowd called out. A young black man with a skateboard tucked under his arm. "How does it feel now? You scared?" Ricardo swallowed hard, unable to find an answer. He knew any response would only sound hollow, inadequate. The reality of his situation hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just a cop who'd made a mistake. He was the embodiment of every abuse of power that communities of color had faced for generations. He wasn't just losing his temper. He was the system, the very thing he had promised to protect and serve, but had instead weaponized against the innocent. I was wrong," Ricardo muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough that the people around him could hear. "I didn't mean for this to happen." A middle-aged woman stepped forward, shaking her head in disbelief. "You didn't mean for this to happen? How many times have you done this to other people who didn't have a title to protect them? How many times have you bullied someone just because you could?" Ricardo's shoulders slumped further, and tears stung his eyes. He tried to blink them away, but the rawness of the moment overwhelmed him. He looked around, desperate for someone, anyone, to show him a shred of sympathy, but all he saw were faces hardened by years of distrust, of having to live with the knowledge that people like him saw them as less than. Marcos, who had been walking away, paused and turned back, catching Ricardo's eye one last time. For a moment, the two men locked gazes, and Ricardo saw not just anger or contempt in Marcos's eyes, but a deep, profound sadness. That, more than anything, cut through Ricardo's defenses. He had expected fury, outrage, but not this, not the disappointment that was now etched across Marcos's face. Marcos took a step toward him, his voice calm but filled with an authority that Ricardo had never managed to muster. "What you do next," Marcos said quietly, "will define the rest of your life. You have a choice to make, Officer Almeida. You can either be the man who abused his power or the man who decided to change. But you need to understand that change starts with taking responsibility." Ricardo's lip trembled, and for a moment, he looked like a lost child, stripped of all the arrogance and bravado that had defined him. He nodded slowly, unable to find the words, but something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding, of remorse. It wasn't enough to undo what he'd done, but it was a start. I'll face it," Ricardo finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "Good," Marcos replied, offering him a small, sad smile. "That's the first step. But remember, it's not about what you say now. It's about what you do from here on out." And with that, Marcos turned away again, leaving Ricardo to confront the consequences of his actions. This time, Ricardo didn't try to stop him. He simply stood there, surrounded by a crowd that no longer saw him as a figure of authority, but as a man who had to face his own demons. And for the first time in his life, Ricardo felt the weight of true accountability pressing down on him, forcing him to confront the reality of who he had become. As Marcos walked away, Ricardo felt the full weight of the crowd's stares on his back, the silent judgment burning into him. He wasn't sure what to do next. All his life, he had relied on his badge to give him a sense of purpose, a sense of power. But now, that badge felt like a shackle, a symbol of everything he had done wrong. He turned, watching Marcos's retreating figure, and something inside him snapped. He couldn't let it end like this, not without understanding. "Wait," Ricardo called out, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please wait." Marcos paused, his shoulders tensing before he turned around slowly. The crowd grew quiet, their phones still recording, but their attention was now fixed on the two men. Ricardo took a shaky step forward, his hands trembling at his sides. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Why didn't you fight back? You could have destroyed me." Marcos regarded him with an expression that was both weary and compassionate, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He took a step closer, studying Ricardo's face, and then sighed deeply. "Because fighting you wouldn't have solved anything," Marcos replied. "If I had fought back, I would have become another headline, another statistic. And you would have gone home feeling justified, feeling like you were in the right. But by standing my ground, by refusing to play into your narrative, I forced you to see me. Not as a threat, not as a criminal, but as a human being. Ricardo swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't understand, he said, shaking his head. I thought I was protecting this neighborhood. I thought I was doing my job. Marcos stepped even closer, his eyes never leaving Ricardo's. You were doing what you were taught to do, Marcos said softly, but there was no pity in his tone. You were taught to see me as the other, as someone who doesn't belong. You were taught that your badge made you superior, that it gave you the right to judge, to control. But real power isn't about control, Ricardo. It's about understanding. It's about seeing the humanity in the people you're supposed to serve. Ricardo's eyes welled up, and he blinked rapidly, struggling to keep his emotions in check. I never thought about it like that, he admitted, his voice trembling. I've spent so many years thinking that wearing this uniform made me better, that it made me the law. But now you realize that the law is meant to protect, not to oppress, Marcos finished for him. And it's meant to serve everyone, regardless of their skin color, their background, or where they come from. But I've already done so much damage, Ricardo said, his voice barely above a whisper. How can I ever make this right? Marcos was silent for a moment, then took a deep breath. You can start by listening, he said, by acknowledging the harm you've caused, not just to me, but to every person you've ever treated as less than. And then, you work to change, not just yourself, but the system that allowed you to believe that this kind of behavior was acceptable. Ricardo nodded slowly, a tear finally escaping and sliding down his cheek. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do that, he confessed, his voice breaking. You are, Marcos replied firmly. Strength isn't about never making mistakes. It's about facing them, owning them, and doing better moving forward. That's where real courage lies. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything was still. Ricardo looked down, nodding again. And when he looked back up, there was a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I will, he promised. I'll do whatever it takes. Marcos offered him a small, but genuine smile. Then you've taken the first step, he said. But remember, this journey is long, and it's not just about you. It's about changing the way we see each other, about building a world where no one has to prove their worth or their humanity. Ricardo nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. He watched as Marcos turned and continued walking, disappearing into the crowd that parted for him like a river. And as he stood there, surrounded by the murmurs of the onlookers, Ricardo felt something shift within him. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something he had never thought possible. And though he knew the road ahead would be hard, for the first time, he was ready to walk it. As Marcos walked away, Ricardo stood there, still reeling from the conversation that had just taken place. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not without casting lingering, disapproving glances in his direction. He could feel the judgment in their eyes, the silent condemnation of his actions. It was a feeling he had never experienced so intensely before, and it left him feeling exposed, vulnerable, and deeply ashamed. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of sirens. 2 police cars pulled up, and several officers stepped out, their eyes darting between Ricardo and the crowd. One of them, a sergeant, approached with a look of concern. Ricardo, he said sharply, what the hell is going on here? Ricardo struggled to find his voice. He had always been the one in control, the one who issued orders, but now, all he could do was stammer. It was a misunderstanding, he mumbled, avoiding the sergeant's gaze. I made a mistake. The sergeant glanced around, taking in the faces of the people still recording, the lingering tension in the air. A mistake? He repeated, incredulous. Do you have any idea how serious this is? We've got multiple complaints about you right now, and this, he gestured to the phones, this is going to be all over the news? Ricardo's heart sank. He had known, deep down, that there would be consequences, but hearing it said out loud made it real. I'm sorry, he whispered, but the words felt hollow, even to him. Sorry isn't going to cut it, the sergeant snapped. You're going to be placed on administrative leave while this is investigated. Hand over your badge and your weapon." For a moment, Ricardo stood frozen, the weight of those words crashing down on him. His badge, the symbol of his authority, the thing he had used to shield himself from his own insecurities, was now being taken from him. With trembling hands, he unhooked the badge from his uniform and handed it over, followed by his gun. The sergeant took them without a word, his expression hard. "We'll be in touch," the sergeant said, turning away. "And I suggest you start thinking about how you're going to explain this to Internal Affairs." As the officers left, Ricardo was left standing alone, feeling as if the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. He looked around and saw that many people were still recording, still watching, and he felt an overwhelming urge to run, to hide. But he knew that there was nowhere he could go to escape the reality of what he had done. Meanwhile, as Marcos walked home, he felt a mixture of emotions swirling inside him: relief, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of exhaustion. He had faced countless challenges in his life, had fought against prejudice and injustice in so many forms, but this confrontation had shaken him in a way that few others had. It was a reminder that no matter how far he had come, no matter how much he had achieved, there would always be those who saw him as less than, simply because of the color of his skin. When he arrived home, his wife, Clarice, was waiting for him on the porch, her face etched with worry. "I saw the video," she said quietly, wrapping her arms around him as he reached the steps. "Are you okay?" Marcos nodded, but he couldn't find the words to speak. He simply held her, drawing strength from her embrace. After a few moments, he pulled back and looked into her eyes. "It's never going to end, is it?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of years of battles fought and scars earned. Clarice cupped his face in her hands, her gaze steady and filled with love. "No," she said gently, "but every time you stand up, every time you refuse to be silenced, you bring us one step closer to the change we need. You're not just fighting for yourself, Marcos. You're fighting for all of us." Marcos nodded, his resolve hardening once more. "Then I'll keep fighting," he said quietly. "I'll keep pushing back, as long as I have to." The video of the encounter went viral within hours. News outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded with discussions about racial profiling, police brutality, and the systemic issues that allowed officers like Ricardo to act with impunity. The attention quickly led to an internal investigation, and it wasn't long before Ricardo found himself facing disciplinary action. He was suspended without pay pending a formal review, and the department issued a public statement condemning his actions. But for Marcos, the real victory wasn't in seeing Ricardo face consequences. It was in the conversations that were sparked, in the way people rallied around his story, using it as a catalyst to demand change. He had always believed that change didn't happen overnight, that it took countless small battles to shift the tide. And as he watched the world respond, he felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, this was one of those battles that would help tip the scales toward justice. For Ricardo, the reality of what he had done continued to sink in. He spent sleepless nights replaying the encounter in his head, haunted by the memory of Marcos's words, of the disappointment and strength in his eyes. It would be a long road to redemption, one that would require him to confront not just his actions but the beliefs and prejudices that had fueled them. And though he didn't know if he could ever truly make amends, he vowed to try, to learn, and to become the man he should have been all along. In the weeks that followed, Marcos watched as the world around him grappled with the incident that had transpired in that small park. It was no longer just a local story. It had become a national conversation. News channels replayed the footage over and over, dissecting every detail, every word exchanged between him and Ricardo. The video ignited debates about systemic racism, police accountability, and the insidious nature of implicit bias. People from all walks of life reached out to Marcos, thanking him for his courage, for standing up not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been in a similar situation but felt powerless to fight back. Despite the overwhelming attention, Marcos remained grounded. He knew that this incident, while important, was just one moment in a much larger struggle. He continued his work at the courthouse, delivering judgments and advocating for fairness with renewed determination. He spoke at community meetings, schools, and public forums, using his voice to educate and inspire others about the importance of knowing their rights, of standing up against injustice, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. One evening, as he sat in his study surrounded by law books and case files, Marcos received an unexpected letter. The handwriting was shaky, and there was no return address, but he immediately recognized the signature at the bottom. Ricardo Almeida. Dear Judge Silva, it began. I've spent every day since that morning thinking about what happened. I've watched the video countless times, trying to understand how I could let myself become the man I was in that moment. I wish I could say that I didn't mean it, that it wasn't really me, but I know that would be a lie. I was that man, and for that, I am truly, deeply sorry. Ricardo went on to describe how the fallout from the incident had forced him to confront truths he had spent his whole life ignoring. He wrote about the therapy sessions he had started, the books he was reading about racial bias and privilege, and the conversations he was having with community leaders and activists. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He knew he hadn't earned it. But he wanted Marcos to know that he was trying to change, that he was committed to being better, to learning and unlearning, no matter how painful or uncomfortable the process. I know I may never have the chance to make things right, the letter concluded, but I want you to know that your courage changed me. You made me see myself for who I really was, and because of that, I am trying to become a man who deserves a second chance. Marcos sat back, holding the letter in his hands, feeling a mix of emotions wash over him. He had always believed in the possibility of redemption, that even the most deeply ingrained prejudices could be unraveled if people were willing to face the truth about themselves. But it was one thing to believe it in theory, and another to witness it unfolding in reality. A week later, Marcos found himself back at the park. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the grass, and the air was filled with the sounds of children laughing and dogs barking. As he set down his gym bag and began his workout, he saw a familiar figure standing at the edge of the park, watching him hesitantly. It was Ricardo. For a moment, Marcos considered ignoring him, letting him stand there alone. But then he remembered the words he had spoken to Ricardo, about change, about accountability, about the power of seeing each other's humanity. So, he took a deep breath and waved him over. Ricardo approached slowly, uncertainty etched into every line of his face. He was dressed in plain clothes now, stripped of the uniform that had once given him a sense of power. I didn't mean to intrude, he said quietly, stopping a few feet away. I wanted to thank you for everything. Marcos nodded, studying him for a moment. It's not about thanking me, he replied. It's about what you do from here. It's about the choices you make moving forward. I know, Ricardo said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm trying. I really am. Marcos regarded him for a long moment, then offered a small, encouraging smile. That's all any of us can do. Keep trying. The two men stood there in silence for a moment, two individuals from different worlds brought together by a shared moment of reckoning. Then, with a nod, Marcos turned back to his workout, and Ricardo quietly took a seat on a nearby bench, watching, reflecting, and perhaps, for the first time, truly understanding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcos felt a sense of peace settle over him. The world was far from perfect, and the fight for justice and equality was far from over. But for this moment, in this small park, there was hope. And sometimes, he realized, that was enough to keep moving forward. And so, the story ended not with grand resolutions or sweeping changes, but with two men standing in a park. One who had found his voice, and another who was learning to listen. And in that simple, quiet moment, there was the promise of a better future, one step at a time. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's really moving.